Hello, everyone. I'm Leslie Slavitt, Executive Director of the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University. We're delighted to host today's webinar on 11 Trends in Philanthropy for 2024. It's the Johnson Center's 8th annual Trends Report, which aims to help practitioners anticipate and embrace what's next in the sector. Delighted to share that we have a sold out attendance here today, folks from all over the country and beyond. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. And in fact, we'd love to know where you're from. So please go ahead, drop your name and location in the chat as we do a little bit of housekeeping and some introductory remarks before our conversation. Housekeeping. So just sharing with everybody that the webinar is being recorded. A link to the recording will be shared with you by the end of the week. If you have any technical issues or want to participate in the conversation, please feel free to use the chat feature throughout this conversation. The second half of today's conversation will be a Q&A. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function. You can do that at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll make sure to curate those at the end. In just a moment, we're going to be joined by our panelists, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to those terrific colleagues who will be joining me here today for the conversation. First, I'd like to introduce Don Chen. Don is the president of the Surdna Foundation, a national family foundation dedicated to racial justice by fostering sustainable environments, inclusive economies, and thriving cultures. I'm also delighted to welcome Stacy Palmer. Stacy is the chief executive of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, an organization that offers a monthly magazine, news, advice, and opinion sections, and a host of webinars, briefings, and other services for and about the nonprofit sector and the foundation world. Palmer helped found the organization in 1988 and has overseen its transition as it became an independent nonprofit in 2023. And finally, it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Akilah Watkins. Akilah is the president and CEO of Independent Sector, a national membership organization of more than 350 nonprofit, philanthropic, CSR, and university partners working to build and sustain a healthy, equitable, charitable sector. And before we dive into the conversation, just going to provide a brief overview to sort of level set us with the conversation we'll have today. So regarding trends, I often get this question, which is what makes a trend? And so a trend is a topic or issue that's moving. It's not necessarily entirely novel or new, but we're seeing it either increase or decrease or change in some noticeable significant way. This year's trends share a wealth of examples, data, quotes, and research that aims to help you and your networks look to the future of the field. But at the core of the 2024 report, you will find a set of questions rather than a set of answers. Each trend poses moral, economic, equity-related, tactical, and other questions that the sector will have to answer as we continue to work for the public good. Some answers are likely to come sooner. For others, it may be a while before we fully understand the implications of whether and how choices will be made. In short, it's a snapshot of the sector, highlighting where concerns are, but also action and initiatives to help advocate and embrace for what's next, offering practitioners, donors, and community stakeholders real data, insightful perspective, and research examples to help them inform and support their daily work. And Trends is wholly a Johnson Center product. It's research, curated, written, and edited by my colleagues here at the Johnson Center with a level of disciplinary rigor that deepens the sector's knowledge, reflection, and ultimately, we hope its actions. I'm going to quickly review the 11 trends for 2024, and then we'll begin today's conversation. And so we've just posted them here today. I know many of you have read the report. We've had wonderful responses and emails and comments. But it's just a reminder of the breadth of the topics and the depth that they cover. And so we see issues related to the crisis of the Black Cliff, issues related to AI, donor anonymity, affordable housing. And so really a significant trend portfolio here that we're going to discuss. And within that, it's been interesting for us this year, perhaps because there are so many really provocative and important questions being raised, that we've really begun to see traction already. And I'll be very interested to know if our panelists are seeing what we've been hearing so far in the ether. Issues, again, related to the Glass Cliff, Gen Z and philanthropy, investing in the South have really provoked a lot of conversation already. And so with that, I'm excited to turn the conversation over to our panelists. We have lots to talk about. So, Don, Stacy, and Daquila, I know I was going to challenge you to pick one trend that really resonated with you most and why, but I have a slight twist on the question, which is, if there is one that really resonates with you, why? And if you can't narrow it down to less than 3, what is so profound about what we see in these 11 trends this year, that you're unable to sort of narrow down your thinking? And so, Stacy, I saw you smile first, so I'm going to put the question to you.
Okay, I might go with the 3. I think you came up with some excellent trends. So donor anonymity is the one that I'm really glad you called out, because I don't think we talk enough about those issues, and I think they're really going to be on the rise. Generation Z is having an amazing effect. I mean, after growing up in COVID and in lockdown, they're creating their own nonprofits. They are the workers. They are thinking about so many other things. It was kind of impossible to be in this field and not think about things like AI, because that is what's going to have the transformative effect. I would choose all of the other ones if I had a chance to, but those 3 are the ones that rose to the top for me.
Perfect. Don, are you agreeing or disagreeing? Are you seeing some of the same things Stacy's seeing, or are you seeing some other things?
Well, I agree with her that it's really hard to choose. The one, if I had to pick one, which was our original mandate here, I would choose the glass cliff one, because this is a trend and a challenge that the Cerna Foundation and a lot of other funders in the field have seen coming for a long time. It's actually a phenomenon that many of us have observed for a while, namely that we have people of color, you highlight Black women in particular, taking over CEO roles from longtime founders and not being set up for success, not being supported enough by their boards, by other folks in the broader community. And that's something that Cerna Foundation has taken very seriously over the years. So I'll just briefly mention that one thing that we try to do to counteract the cliff aspect of it is providing long-term general support, partnership in many aspects of the work, including learning. We also have an initiative that my staff has developed called the Resilient Organizations Initiative, in which we basically pay for technical assistance providers to help nonprofits and leaders with leadership development, setting up technology systems, fundraising, and financial management. So I think and there's still a lot of work to be done to make sure that future leaders are successful, particularly people of color who've taken over from long-time leaders.
Thank you, Don. And Daquila, to you, are you seeing similar, different? Love to have your perspective and why.
So I absolutely agree with my panelist, and particularly, obviously I care about Black women in the glass cliff for a lot of different reasons. Obviously, I'm sort of living some of that reality. I also think the thing that is transforming and that has the most transformative power is around the role of technology. It is really something we are hearing just sort of more and more. Artificial intelligence and sort of the role it will play in philanthropy and the nonprofit sector, I think, is something that is keeping me up. I mean, choosing 3 is hard, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about affordable housing, because I am a houser.
Yep.
And how I am deeply worried about the sort of relationship future Americans will have with the concept of homeownership. It's transforming radically in real time, and I think we should spend some time talking about it and help shaping it in a way that's fair and equitable.
So I'm going to build on that, because I think what we really want to do is sort of identify the sort of both sort of advice, actions, opportunities to really, raise the right questions so we can start to seek the important answers sort of in the sector. And so because you really sort of highlighted that for us, Daquila, let's stay on that for a minute and let's actually talk about affordable housing. I know it's been a topic we've all touched on and talked about before. I was privileged to be the research assistant and felt a joint author on this year's affordable housing trend. And so what are some of those two key questions? Where do you think the sector can really come in? Where do you think it is right now, and where do you think it needs to go? Akil, if you have thoughts on that, be great. Otherwise, Don, I know you have depth in this, would love to hear your perspective on that.
That's how Don and I first met through affordable housing work. So I'm sort of waiting to hear your perspective on this, Don. So, I'll say a couple of things. I do think philanthropy can play a role in sort of the future of affordable housing. I think, first of all, we have to figure out what is the future, right? Sort of what is, like, how do we envision homeownership being part of sort of the developmental cycle of people now in America, right? So when we were growing up, homeownership was just something you did. It was how you sort of entered adulthood, along with, get a job, get married, homeownership. And now we've decoupled that in a lot of ways from what it means to be an adult. And there are a lot of different reasons why we've done that. I will say this, that in a lot of ways, I think philanthropy can help sort of spark and innovate around homeownership. This is where I think I'm a bit of a relic. I think we have to really engage public systems in homeownership, affordable homeownership. I think it is a right of Americans to be able to live in safe homes that they can afford. And I think that's something we should talk about as part of the social contract of America. What does that look like? And it's such a vast problem that and challenge that I don't particularly think philanthropy can solve that on its own, outside of creating innovative sort of ideas that public systems can help scale. So yeah, I'll stop there.
So Don, I think that was perfectly teed up for you. If you could take reflection from there and really sort of what questions philanthropy should be asking, and what really is our role, and how do we leverage it to the maximum extent we're able to.
Sure. Yeah, I'll maybe begin by acknowledging that housing is an issue that philanthropy-minded people have been tackling for over a century. You look back at settlement houses in Chicago, Jane Hull, and that movement around the turn of the last century, up until, the Gray Areas program in the 1950s, with Ford Foundation's involvement, the birth of the community development field, home ownership. There are different phases and different attempts to try to address this set of issues. And I think it is incredibly painfully evident today that these measures that we have in place, the mechanisms, the policy infrastructure, is incredibly inadequate, and we're all paying the price. And these days, housing is not just defined as housing. As Keela said, it is, there's a strong connection to health. There's a strong connection to community wealth and well-being. There's a strong connection to environmental outcomes. And so housing is connected to all kinds of pathways to individual and community well-being, and also, our global conditions. So it is urgent. As a person who's worked in housing for 3 decades now, I think the frustrating realization that many of us have come to is that not only are our existing tools, whether you're in philanthropy or the private sector and policymaking world, inadequate, I think that we have a paradigm that is very based on private sector collaboration, on tax credits. We've also seen a system that is brittle to the point where it really cracked and resulted in a tremendous loss of wealth and stability for families during the mortgage foreclosure crisis. And so the thing that I'm really focused on these days, and Cerna is not formally a housing funder. That's something I'll talk about in a second. But the thing that I'm focused on these days is how can funders really come together to develop alternatives to the current system, where you might have, for example, folks who are focused on permanent affordability, on, for example, shared equity home ownership, on deed restrictions to ensure that properties are in permanent affordability, on land use and other regulatory measures to ensure, for example, that properties aren't purchased to be used as Airbnb properties, those types of things. In addition to that, I think there needs to be much more of a narrative and communications effort to underscore the importance of this set of issues, because as we all know, housing has ripple effects throughout the economy, and it needs to be elevated to a more prominent place in our discourse. When I was at the Ford Foundation, many foundations were in the process of getting out of the housing field, much to many of our, like we were just really bemoaning that. And a number of us came together and formed a group called Funders for Housing and Opportunity. And that was a focal point to get foundations to come and work on housing together and to try to encourage other foundations to do that. At the same time, there was a set of folks working on tenants' rights and fighting displacement and those types of issues. And that has grown very robustly through the Right to the City network and others. So I feel like there is important work being done, but we really need like a quantum leap in activity and also a set of paradigm shifts in how we do housing, how we provide affordability in this country. And that is, it's not really clear how we're going to get there. And so hopefully that'll be in your 2025 trends report.
Absolutely. We're already working on it, in fact. Stacey, you've had such a thoughtful and good look across the sector. I'd be interested, even though, it was hard to narrow down to just 3 in terms of the trends that sort of resonated with you the most. What was missing? What was surprising that we didn't cover? Have you seen things that you expected to see and didn't for some reason?
Yeah, and these are terrific ones. And when we did our own trends report, we had to leave a lot of things on the cutting room floor. So, I think there's a broader leadership issue and crisis in the field. And, you can see that through some of these trends. But, I would expect when you're doing it next year, the number of organizations that can't find anybody who even wants to lead the organization, the fact that it is not seen as something that is a great thing to do is incredibly important. And it's connected to the way a lot of philanthropy flows. The lack of unrestricted funding, the lack of multi-year funding is just causing some folks who had wonderful aspirations to lead their organizations say, I don't want to do this anymore, but they're all becoming consultants to nonprofits. So they are still helping the field with their expertise. But the idea that this job isn't a good one and that the entire C-suite is suffering from a challenge, I think you're going to see that. The other issue we're paying a lot of attention to, and I suspect we'll all want to talk about, is the impact of polarization and what some people call toxic polarization at this point, which is really dangerous. It's not just because it's an election year. We are seeing tremendous divides. It's really thwarting philanthropy's ability to get anything done. And at the Chronicle, we're going to debut a special section that kicks off in April that's going to focus on all the ways nonprofits and philanthropy can make a difference in closing every kind of divide, not just political, but all of the ones we see in this country, because we think that that's crucially important. So those might have been some things that I would have included.
Absolutely. And then if you think about the way sort of the trends knit together, right? And so, I think, Akil and Don, as you were talking about affordable housing and the sort of interconnectedness of what it means to be a healthy, stable, vibrant community, education, housing stability and education, success are so intertwined. I'm interested, and I caught this a little bit in the conversation between Stacey, when you mentioned Gen Z, and then, Akila, when you were talking about housing, right? That there's a lot of throughputs and connective tissue. No one trend sits in isolation in the same way that no one issue and community is relevant without context to the other issues and needs around it. And so I'm interested on any of those sort of throughputs that you see in the trends and sort of maybe help us make a little bit of meaning out of those. And so I just pointed out one, Gen Z and housing. I wonder if there's other sort of connective tissue that you see throughout the trends that you can help us make a little more meaning around. It's hard to put into 1,000 words.
No. Well, I'll just add my perspective on it. I will just say that Gen Z, the one word I will describe, it is going to be tremendous change, right? So even in your trends report, you're actually listing the life-changing history that folks who literally have been born in the last 25, 30 years have went through. It has been tremendous when we think about, the mortgage meltdown crisis, COVID, the reorganizing of community, George Floyd. I mean, there is so, the election, our sort of electoral politics, over the last several years. There's been so much change, and we are feeling it in the nonprofit sector. So, even to Stacey's point around, and I'm talking specifically around Gen Zs, when we think about leadership, right? Like being an organizational leader was one of sort of the highest achievements you could obtain in the sector. And today, that is not necessarily the case, right? And so what looks like success, what looks like a very, having a good career, things have just been just deeply radically changed in ways. So what it does in a lot of ways is that it causes us to have to be a lot more present, to not have to assume, right? So, the assumptions that I've had, and I'm part of Generation X, I think. So the assumptions I had don't necessarily come through in today's world. So Gen Zers aren't actually sort of looking to sort of rise organizationally through the organizational hierarchy in ways that, I was conditioned to. And so what does that mean in terms of how do we prepare the next generation for leadership? It is one of the largest challenges we're facing now, especially as baby boomers are retiring. We still have quite a bit of baby boomers in leading organizations, leading parts of the sector, and they will be retiring within the next 10 years. And we don't necessarily have, not quantity of people ready to take over, but sort of the natural internal will to want to take over, because running an organization is different today. Gen Zers are demanding more levels of transparency in organizations. They want more shared power models, all these things, whether or not you think they're good or you think they're not good, they're here to stay. They have incorporated technology in a way that is very synergistic. And so I think organizations have to be prepared for just the increased amount of change that Gen Zs are sort of ushering in. I will just say one thing about the toxicity, the political toxicity that we find ourselves in. This is one of our, major threats to our sector. The nonprofit sector doesn't just serve Americans that are in blue or red states. We serve all Americans. And sometimes, part of my job is I have to remind people of the full breadth of the nonprofit sector. And we go where the need is, where the hurt is, and we go to repair. And it takes just a lot. We have to be very intentional about not getting sort of pigeonholed in these political boxes, because it's not going to be good for the sector. Americans from all backgrounds volunteer, they give, they work. 12.5 million Americans from all parts of the political aisle work in the nonprofit sector. And we are very, very inclusive of the political lives of people. And so it's important for us to have to remind folks of that.
Lovely. Stacey, Don,
Yeah.
any feedback, reflection on that? Don, please go ahead.
Sure. I'm thinking about what Stacey Aniakila mentioned just now about polarization and Gen Z. So many of the trends that you identified are inherently about civic participation, democracy, civil society, and that could be a trend unto itself. I think a lot of us are feeling very acutely that democracy, many aspects of democracy, institutions, the franchise, et cetera, are really threatened this year, and it feels quite nerve-wracking. And I think what we'll see in 2024 is more and more foundations trying to devote themselves to ensuring that democratic practices and civil society remain strong, no matter who becomes president next, no matter what different administrations try to do. And I would identify that, if you look at the AAPI participation, more finer grained demographic data that are being collected or will be collected by the federal government. The importance of the South in this country, politically, culturally, economically. Those are all aspects of civic participation and democracy. And I think funders are really responding to that through line.
That's terrific. Stacy, any thoughts on that? Any reflections from your perspective?
Yeah, and I do. I think it's fascinating, especially to think about the funding patterns in the South, and whether that stays as a trend, because we've seen, inattention to so many parts of this country. Rural America is often neglected. And maybe that's a question to ask for all of these trends. What's the staying power of all of them, the ones that we think are most important? And what can we do to advance the ones that we want to see? And what do we need to do to avert the real crises?
Yeah, I'm happy to say, Leslie, that the many of the reports and analyses that you cited in your write-up about the South informed the Sirna Foundation strategy to fund more in the South when I first came. And so we went from about a fifth of our grantee organizations saying that they worked in the South back in 2019 to today, I think about a little over a third. And I think you're starting to see that in a lot of foundations that work nationally.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things which is important to note, going back to what a trend is, Stacy, which is it's something that's moving, right? And so to your point, it could be we think it's going up. And so our opportunity and the need within the sector is to say, okay, if we think it's important and we want to see the trend continue and advance or increase in pace, we need to be aware and do something about it. Or a trend is something that's decreasing. It's not advancing, right? And are we okay with that? Should we sunset something appropriately and move on to something else? Or are we at risk of losing some important currency because we're not asking the questions, we're not investing in the types of practice that need to move forward to keep important issues at the forefront and moving forward. And so I think that's the interesting thing about a trend, right? We feel like it's something that's advancing, getting larger, but it may not necessarily be. But I think, Don, to your point, and this was a question I'm going sort of outside the Q&A that somebody put in the chat, was about the approach to the trends and about their rigor. I think in some instances, one could almost see that the citations are as long as the actual 1,000-word articles. These are deeply researched, very, very, very rigorous, deeply engaged work to try to, as is, the purview of the Johnson Center, to ensure that we go where the research takes us, and I think that's something that's really critical. One of the things, and I think we're building on this a little bit, is, how are what you're seeing in the trends going to help inform your work? How do you take back what you're hearing in terms of raising those questions that you think need to be asked? We talked about that a little bit with affordable housing, but even in the proposed changes to federal race and ethnicity standards, this will change the way our sector operates, right? And what do we have to do to think through that, to be prepared, and to lean into the real meaning of what could be happening here? It's a big question. I can restate it. But what do you see here that you want to prioritize? Let's ask it that way.
Well, let me just say there's it's a lot of stuff to prioritize, but I'll say a few things. I think your trend about the South was particularly interesting to me, partly because when we're talking about electoral politics, nonprofit organizations are one of the key ways that we can move Americans to the polls. And so nonprofits are a great way for Americans to deeply get involved in civic life, whether that's voting, whether that's volunteering in their local community, whether it's tackling sort of larger issues. And to see the political strength in the South grow, and minority strength in the South grow. I mean, minority growth in the South is growing among all groups. I also think it's going to be a hotbed for electoral politics too, right? And it's important for us to make sure that organizations in the South have a really good handle on advocacy. So, the independent sector, we just did a report called A Retreat from Influence, where we looked at how advocacy numbers across the sector have been declining. In 22 years ago, about 61% of nonprofits participated in some level of political advocacy at a local, state, or federal level. That number is roughly around 31% today. And when we think about where we are as a society in terms of how many Americans vote, how many Americans are volunteering, that worries us, that nonprofits are not sort of seizing their power in the way that they could. And the South, I think in particular, this is going to be a very interesting time because it is growing in terms of its political strength, in terms of its population strength. And we at Independent Sector are really trying to, just take a more just focused look on the South, and making sure that the organizations down there are strong and they understand sort of how to advocate, and that they understand the rules of advocacy, that they have strong coalitions to tap into, and that funders know, how important it is to fund advocacy work. And in fact, we want to highlight some of the importance of why it's important to invest in the nonprofit sector, particularly in the South. And we will be doing that with our national convening happening in Atlanta in 2025, just as one example.
And I think that raises a good point, right? So it's sort of going one level below. And so it's one thing to look in sort of an overarching way at how things are trending in the South, but in terms of the changes in philanthropy and grant making, but what does it mean in terms of specifically, what are the program areas? Like Don, you gave a terrific statistic, right? That said we went from X% to Y%. But from a program or strategy or context perspective, what does that change reflect for the foundation, for your focus? So, going, I think if we if you can go one step below that, it'd be helpful, I think, to understand what it means to make that kind of shift.
I can take the next crack at your question. I'd like to answer your question in 4 ways.
Please.
And the first way is going to break the rules. I'm going to answer, I'm going to ask for a prioritization of something that is not one of the 11 trends, and that is the fact that we're seeing a backlash against racial equity, inclusion, and racial justice efforts. This is something that has been covered very well in the Chronicle of Philanthropy and other outlets, and it is very concerning. I think this is the priority for the Certain Foundation and many others, and it really gets at so many of these other important themes, i.e. Democratic participation, making sure we have an inclusive society, trying to solve problems together, overcoming polarization. So that would be the first thing I would prioritize. Second one I would prioritize is in the category of things that foundations can do in their tightest spheres of influence. In other words, things that they can do right now. And I would address the glass ceiling issue, supporting women of color, Black women in particular, who have taken over as CEOs, and making sure that as funders, we're really signaling support for these leaders through leadership development, through other types of efforts beyond the money, beyond the check. To me, that's critically important. A third category is what I would describe as things that we can prioritize where a little bit of extra help goes a long way. I would count the AAPI, NHPI grant making as a factor there. As you noted in your report, only 20 cents of every $100 of philanthropic resources go to NHPI organizations and communities. And even if foundations, donors did a little bit more, it would make a big difference in that regard. And then finally, things that I think are outside perhaps individual grant makers, individual foundations' influence, but really require partnership. I would say AI falls in that category. I'm speaking at tomorrow's AI and Philanthropy Forum here in New York City. And one of the big themes that it's being put on by the Partnership on AI and other organizations. And one of the big themes is the importance of partnerships. I think so many of us, even those who are paying very close attention to the field, don't really know exactly what to expect. All these issues are coming thick and fast, and we really need to problem solve, analyze, develop solutions together. Private sector, government, nonprofits, philanthropy. We need to work across sectors to try to identify things that are really important to our society, and how we can head off some of the looming challenges that people have already begun to identify. So those would be the 4 ways I would
Yeah.
answer your question about prioritization.
And so I'm going to go one step deeper, and this is a tough one, Don. So managing your expectations is going back to AI and the partnership and the approach, which, you know, I think reflects back to some of the conversation we had in affordable housing, right? Which for me goes to the role of philanthropy, right? Which is a question often asked. And so if you look at AI in this case, because it builds on your last comment, and you look at the sort of cadre of partners that need to come together, is there a particular role that philanthropy should lean into hard and really occupy a space? And what does it do that in a way that's generative or supportive or advances the sort of overall partnership? What role do we play in that puzzle? Or what role should we play?
You want me to take that on first?
I do.
Okay, I'm happy to. Well, actually, reading your report, I was surprised to know that foundations have played a role in the development of AI historically, and that was fascinating unto itself. I think for me, the key thing is the development of an ethical framework, the development of standards, expectations, what we want from our AI. You know, I've been a student of technology and its effect on society for decades. You know, I have a healthy appreciation for the fact that technology comes in many forms. It's really the human beings that shape what happens to it, how we use it, how we allow each other to use it. And that suggests a regulatory environment, ethical framework, development of societal norms and narratives about what technology should do for us. And to me, we still don't have that. You know, that would be a nice counterbalance to some of the techno optimists, you know, who, of course, bless them, they have the ability to imagine better things in our lives and problems being solved in innovative ways. And at the same time, we have to take you know, the doomsayers very seriously, because a lot of this stuff can go sideways very quickly. So that ethical framework and understanding societal expectations and norms, I think, is going to be critical.
Thank you. And Stacey, I'd like to move that question to you because, you know, in the 2024 trends report, this was our 3rd trend on AI, right? As we've all noted. And so from your sort of long lens perspective, I'm interested if you have a sense of how far we've come and how effective philanthropy may have been in sort of occupying a role that is generative in how society moves forward in the space. So do you see anything come to mind as you think back to the evolution of how we got to where we are?
Yeah, and obviously philanthropy plays such an important role in many of these things, but I think technology has moved so fast in this area that there's always a concern that philanthropy isn't doing quite enough to do what Don was talking about, to make sure that the most vulnerable are protected. You know, I mean, what else can philanthropy do except speak out for the people who are most likely to be left out by some of these technology changes and hurt and harmed? Because the technology companies, that is not their main interest in life. And so, you know, there's wonderful things that we can all get excited about, but philanthropy's work in fighting misinformation, doing all of those kinds of things, it just needs to accelerate in so many ways. We see bad actors happening, and philanthropy is not known for its speed. And so, you know, one thing I think we're really going to need to see is everybody, you know, really up their game. I'm really curious about the conference you're going to, Don, tomorrow. I mean, it's urgent that people be talking about this, but I am glad that you've had it for 3 years already.
Absolutely. Well, and we're just coming to the conclusion of the conversation we have before we move to the Q&A. There's been folks, as they've listened to our discussion, who have some things they want to sort of inquire about. But before I do that, I'm just curious to know if any of the panelists have a question they'd like to ask to one of their colleague panelists. Anything, any perspective, any reflection you'd like to have from one another before we move to the Q&A. All right. Well, I will I think everybody on our 500 plus people are going to be very excited that we get to move quickly to the Q&A. We'll try to get through as many of those questions as we can. Just a quick note that some of them are multi-part questions. They're very long, so I will do my best to read quickly and to try to summarize. So I'm going to start with a shorter one. And so Susan is hoping that we'll be able to clarify, why isn't it enough to be a nonprofit leader anymore? What is the challenge, I think, Akilah, that you were articulating, that there seems to be some barrier or lack of appeal or lack of attractiveness? What is it you're seeing? And then I'll ask an additional, and you answered this a little bit before, what we can do, but this is sort of a diagnostic question if you have any additional insights, or any of the other panelists.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the right question. So a couple of different things. So I just completed a 11-city listening tour. So I have talked to probably close to about 1,000 nonprofit leaders around why is it so hard to do your job these days? So I think a couple of things. One is people came back from COVID just different, right? So we have not sort of work got deprioritized in our lives because we were all facing personal existential and collective existential threats over the last 3 years. So people are coming back. Even coming back to the office, people aren't doing that. So leaders now are having to manage organizations with people that live across the country and sometimes across the world. That's difficult. That's difficult in some ways, because our definitions of organizational culture have been very sort of spatially sort of limited, right? We're in the same office, we're in the same place, we build community, we work on these issues together. And now that's not the case. So, for a lot of leaders, they have to try to manage staffs in times where it's hard to hold organizational culture when people aren't sort of collectively in the same space. So that's one. And two, people's ideals around power, organizational hierarchy, they've shifted. They have changed, and we are not going back to those days. And if you've been in the nonprofit sector as long as I think me and my colleagues have here, you remember those days, right? So our definitions or our prioritization around work has shifted. And now staffs they want more power. They want more transparency as to how decisions are made. They want more participatory leadership. All these things they're not bad things. They're really good things, but they take additional time, they take additional resources, and sometimes that doesn't happen. Like, you don't get the sort of resources you need. I think the other important structural thing is that it just costs more to operate a nonprofit today. For a lot of our nonprofit leaders, healthcare premiums for some of them, they've almost doubled in one calendar year, and funding has not matched the operational cost of nonprofits. So we're asking leaders to manage staffs coming back who need more, in a lot of ways, mental health services. People have long-term physical ailments due to COVID, and our health insurance may be woefully able to sort of deal with these challenges, and it costs more to get your staff what they need, and the funding isn't there. So when I say that the world has shifted, and it has shifted at, such a speed, that I think we're sort of deeply feeling the ramifications of this. And I'll say one other thing that's sort of happening in our sector is, in a lot of ways, there's a lot of collectivism work happening, and unionization of the sector is happening. And again, organizational leaders, don't necessarily have a toolkit or training or even dollars available to sort of go through these processes of unionization. So for a lot of organizational leaders, it feels like before COVID, they were one way, they came back, they had to manage through COVID, which was crazy for all of us. And now they came back, and it's like they're coming back to a different world now with a lot of different challenges and not enough resources to meet what the immediate challenges. So all of this is happening simultaneously.
Yep. And so there's such interdependency in the sector, right? And so I'd be interested, Stacy, and then Don, if you have some reflections on that. Is there a sense of recognition that the health of the nonprofit infrastructure and the role it plays in our society and how interdependent that is with the success of the work of philanthropic intention, that foundations and grant makers have? Do you think there's some recognition? I mean, we've certainly for years gone through the general operating support, program support, pendulum back and forth. But is there some sense in terms of the recognition of the cost of overhead, the increasing cost of doing business in the nonprofit sector, for lack of a better way to say that? Do you see that there's an openness to that conversation and change being made? I don't know if you've seen that, Stacy or Don, your thoughts on that?
I'm going to let Don answer first.
Sure, I definitely see greater understanding. The foundations that we work very closely with are already very attuned to that. Generally, foundations that have a social justice mission that recognize the true costs of what it takes to run a nonprofit that's mission oriented, that's trying to do systems change, which takes many years to accomplish. A number of years ago, and this was covered in the Chronicle as well, a consortium of large foundations commissioned a study on the true costs of running a nonprofit, and came up with a number that was perhaps surprising to many funders because it was much bigger than overhead rates that are allowed in grant making, but reflected what's actually true in the field. So I think there's more openness to it, and yet there's still such a long way to go. I think people out in the broader world, individual donors and foundations and whatnot, still use a lot of those websites that use different metrics for assessing the quality of a nonprofit, and some of those are the lowest overhead rate, and they don't realize that they apply mainly to organizations that are service oriented or passing money through or services through, as opposed to organizations that are really trying to seek change and also want to pay their staff and provide healthcare benefits and leadership opportunities and professional development and all those types of things that you would expect from other sectors. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I think for those of us in philanthropy that support philanthropy serving organizations, we fund a lot of philanthropy serving organizations as part of the infrastructure of this field. I've been trying to get my staff to think about nonprofit serving organizations, that nonprofit infrastructure, groups like Independent Sector. How can we play more of a role, just a more intentional effort to try to support the organizations and networks that really help nonprofits with their work. And so to me, there needs to be a little bit of a paradigm shift there, because foundations tend to support philanthropy serving organizations in large part.
Stacey, anything you'd like to reflect on, or should I?
Yeah, and the reason I wanted Don to answer first is that he's part of a group of philanthropists that do understand this issue and advocate for it. Writ large, I am not sure that we're seeing as much of that as everyone had hoped, especially, in the wake of the pandemic. Everybody dropped the restrictions and said, we're going to give multi-year funding and we're going to do this. And there's been a retrenchment on that as far as we can tell. And so I think, in the field writ large, this battle still has to come. I interviewed a large number of nonprofit leaders doing something probably similar to what Akilah did. And I asked them, what is the one thing you would love foundations to do that would help make you stay on the job? And I expected them to say leadership coaching, sabbaticals, and all of those kinds of things. And they all said multi-year unrestricted funding. That's what they need. And it's so simple. It's not more money. It doesn't take more to do it. It is within our grasp, and yet we still can't do it. So I hope that there will be more conversation. I'm really glad we had this question.
Thank you. Yes. And so this is one that's maybe a little bit more provocative. And I think it's a question about essentially about the growth of the nonprofit sector and where it is now. And is there a sense of, are you seeing redundancy? Are you seeing that the nonprofit sector, which, can move slowly, as we talked about foundations, that it's not, that it has a harder time stopping something as it starts something else. So as certain, populations age and change, where they are and what their needs are in the sector, as boomers retire, as issues in community change, is there some sense that you know, some organizations are outliving their sort of utility or aren't changing quickly enough to adjust to changing needs in our sector. That the question here is really about, does it continue to grow sort of unabated without enough reflection on itself as a sector? I'll sort of, it's a very long question. I'm trying to quickly paraphrase parts of it. So I don't know, any thoughts or reflections on that question?
I'm happy to take first crack. So a couple of years ago, I read a wonderful book called Public Citizens by Paul Sabin, who's a historian at Yale. It's about, it largely focuses on Ralph Nader and you know, his contribution to dramatically expanding the nonprofit sector and creating a different ethos within you know, essentially in American liberalism. You know, prior to the era of Nader's Raiders, you had New Deal liberalism from the FDR days, where folks really trusted in government and they trusted in government experts, and there was a partnership between government, labor, and corporations, and you know, they really ran things. Then you had Ralph Nader and various similar things emerge where there was a real skepticism of government and labor and corporations brought in. And what was really interesting about that book and how it's relevant today is that we've seen this tremendous growth in the nonprofit sector where you have folks, you know, when I came into the nonprofit field, you had a whole several generations of professionals who came in wanting to do, you know, gather evidence and to do research and to develop good policy ideas and develop solutions and build partnerships. And then, you know, and this is more on the policy side, work with people in government and work with people from across the political spectrum, Republicans and Democrats, and you know, win victories in terms of policy, then see that through to implementation. These days, I think that is still a workable model, but it's harder and harder to do that based on evidence and willingness to work across the aisle. One thing that I think we've seen become much more important in the nonprofit space, in the social change space, is the importance of narrative change, the importance of getting people to, you know, look at their worldview and reassess and determine whether the way they see things working, the narratives that they have in their head are actually valid, and can those be applied to solutions? And increasingly, I think more and more of our political discourse and the investment in it is really devoted to either, you know, trying to shape people's public opinions and their conventional wisdom, and not really towards evidence. So I think the nonprofit sector really needs to do a lot more on narrative, excuse me, on narrative change in communications. And that's something that I would prioritize. Sorry.
Yep, please. Thank you. And this one, I think we're getting close to the end. And so because AI was such a topic of conversation, apologies, we couldn't get to all the questions. I'm going to end on this one about AI. And this is from somebody who's a fundraiser who states that they've been asked to incorporate AI into the streamlining of their tasks, so that there's an expectation that they're going to get more efficient or more productive by integrating AI into the nature of their business and their work. And he wonders, they wonder about the impact this has on how they think about their job, on ideas about job security, and about where the sector writ large is going to trend if there's that expectation that now, you know, we're talking about not having enough administrative support, right? And now on the other side, there's this growing sense of, you know, we need to weave in efficiency and greater productivity, and that AI is going to allow us to do that. And so I think interesting, any thoughts about that in response to this question?
We've written a lot about that on the impact on fundraising and how people are trying to do that, and that hope that there can be more real live interaction with donors instead of all that administrative kind of work. And I think some people are finding already that it's useful, but you know, we also find some of the limits. You can't let ChatGPT write your grant proposals entirely without you looking at it, or write a note to a donor, because there are going to be incredible mistakes and rather embarrassing ones. But if we can relieve some of the tedium that goes into the administrative tasks involved. Fundraising is one area where there's a lot of that and not nearly as much of talking to donors, making sure that fundraising, is really relational and not transactional. AI has tremendous potential. So I hope we will keep talking about some of those things. And, you've probably read things that Allison Fine and Beth Cantor have written about. We have a lot of them on our site. You can find them elsewhere. I urge you to take a look at those things.
Thank you very much, Stacy. And with that, our webinar is going to come to conclusion. I can't thank Stacy, you, Akilah, and Don enough for your time, for your thoughtfulness, and for your deep and broad commitment to the field. This is one small window into how dedicated and fabulous you all are as colleagues and as leaders in the sector. So I really can't thank you all enough for spending time with us today. I want to urge everybody on the webinar to respond to the evaluation. They'll get a link out which requests an evaluation. We'd love to know how we do. We appreciate your feedback. We want to make sure we do better and bring you questions and information that really empower you. We will also be sending out a link to the recording, so that'll be available to watch on demand on our website and our YouTube channel. So feel free to watch it again, to share it out, to provoke more conversation. Please follow us, follow the Johnson Center on LinkedIn and YouTube, and you can see a full list of upcoming programs on our site, johnsoncenter.org. Again, my great gratitude to our panelists, and I also want to thank everybody from across the country and beyond for joining us here today for this important conversation. I wish everybody a wonderful rest of their week and look forward to engaging again on these important and other important topics.